All right, folks, here we go with the next section of Chapter 7, dealing with Audio Suite. Now, I'll just say this before I start. This section of this chapter is incredibly dense. There's a lot of information here. All of the information that I'm going to go over for you, I would highly encourage that you go over yourself. I also encourage you to go through and do this yourself by going into the software, recording some audio, or just importing an audio clip and exploring the Audio Suite interface itself so that you can really get a grasp on all of the different features. But again, this is something that is very, very dense, and it's very important to know because there are going to be questions on the exam that are centered around the Audio Suite window and what the individual buttons and features of that window do. So we're going to go over them here, but by all means, take the extra time to go over it multiple times. It will really, really be beneficial for you. So I'm on page 181 of your textbook, and we're going to start now. So as you can see here, I have a bunch of different audio files in my session now. 3 different clips to be exact, all have a really different nature. And we're going to utilize these 3 audio clips mostly to see how the Audio Suite window interacts with these clips. I also have the clips list extended here intentionally because we're going to see how the clips list populates as we create new clips with Audio Suite. Just as an overview, just in case we don't remember what Audio Suite is, the Audio Suite menu located up here in our main menu bar are a list of file-based processes or file-based plugins. These are non-real-time, so what that means is they are applied once and then they are written to the file, and we'll talk about either destructively or non-destructively. But these are non-real-time, so once you perform a particular plugin action onto a clip or onto an entire whole file clip, you are in fact writing that type of effect one time, and if you choose to repeat it, you'll have to do it again. So this is very handy for maybe individual isolated clips that have a particular effect on them and that don't occur any other time in your session. This would be helpful because rather than utilizing resources to eat up an entire track with a real-time plugin inserted onto it, you can simply perform a one-shot process to a clip, thereby consolidating resources and not having Pro Tools dedicate an entire resource or two to a whole clip on an individual track with an individual plugin. So on page 181, they talk about that, and then they talk about the features of Audio Suite in general. And I'll just go through those quickly. The Audio Suite features a floating plugin window. So this window, as you can see here, for example, if I bring up the reverb, this is a floating window that that basically changes depending on the type of plugin that you have. But notice how the window stays open. So the Audio Suite itself has a floating window. You have the option to do destructive or non-destructive processing, and we'll talk more about that. You can also analyze playlist-based selections or even entire clips. You can process stereo clips, and also you can process clips on adjacent tracks as well. You also have the opportunity to preview your changes prior to rendering them, which is very, very helpful. And there's a little section here too that talks about some of the features that were introduced with Pro Tools 10 that are also still in 11 as a result. You can now have multiple plugin windows open when you're using Audio Suite. You can, if you have fades already on clips that you choose to process, Pro Tools will automatically keep those fades in there. Remember, we talked about how fades don't work well with elastic audio. Well, with Audio Suite, they do work nicely with it. And then Audio Suite handles, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is very important. It allows you to basically add some buffering, which is kind of like that pre-separate amount we were talking about previously with the clip or with the separate on grid and at transients. And then you also have the option now to for specifically delay and reverb plugins to process in reverse, to do a reverse delay or a reverse reverb. Okay, so let's get into using the plugin itself. Moving on to page 181 and 182, we now go through the 5-step process for using AudioSuite. The first part of that process is to obviously select the audio that you're going to process. I'm going to close this window temporarily. That's the first step. This you can accomplish this in one of two ways. You can, for example, select a portion of a clip like I've done here. In your track playlist, you can obviously not only select on one playlist, but you can select over multiple tracks. You can have multiple selections be processed at one time. You can also select using the clips list. So by going into your clips list, you can click on an entire clip and then bring up the AudioSuite menu and then process that entire clip. You can hold in the Shift key and also you can extend selections, for example. But let's just focus now on making a short little selection right here on this particular clip. I've made my selection. Now I'm going to go into the AudioSuite menu and for step 2, choose the plugin that I want. And I'm going to go in this particular example to the Deverb Reverb. And when I bring up the AudioSuite window, you see this really just looks like the main plugin window, a real-time plugin window that you would get if you just inserted a plugin onto a track. Again, this is a floating window though, it's separate. Now let's go through these individual areas here so that we know what to look for. That's basically step 3 now, is configuring the window to act the way that we want it to act. First of all, this main menu here is your plugin selector. So instead of having to go back to the AudioSuite menu, you can just simply switch plugins by utilizing this menu. Next, your selection reference. Now this is very, very important. This is going to specify whether the plugin is going to process the audio in the track playlist, meaning it's going to look here into the playlist at your selection, or it's going to be looking at a selection that you've made in the clips list. Now remember, I told you can make a selection on a track playlist or you can make a selection in the clips list. Because I have already made a selection on the playlist, I'm going to tell the AudioSuite menu that I'm going to be processing what I have selected in my playlist, not what is in the clips list. If I were to go to clips list, it would assume that I wanted to edit the entire instance of the clip that this selection is on. So I would be processing not just this selection, but the entire clip. And I don't want that, so I'm going to select playlist. The next button right here is the Use in Playlist button. And this is indicating once I process the AudioSuite plugin effect, am I going to replace this selection with the newly processed selection, or am I going to have Pro Tools, if I deselect this, keep this selection intact, don't change anything, but instead the process clip will appear over in my clips list where I can drag and drop it into my session later. So what I'm going to do there, I'm actually going to deselect this. I'll show you both options, but for now I'm going to have it deselected. The next option down here, the processing output mode, this is incredibly important because it highlights, is this going to be a destructive process or a non-destructive process? So I'm going to, for example, bring this menu down and we can see that we have a number of options. The first option here on overwrite files, this is the only destructive option available in the AudioSuite menu. Destructive means that if you choose to click the render button with overwrite files selected, it is going to change the nature of the clip forever. It's going to write it to disk and it's going to be changed permanently. You will not be able to undo this action. So it is a destructive option. It's only to be done if you are very sure that you want to have that particular effect written to that clip permanently. So use that very sparingly. The other two options, the create individual files and the create continuous files, these are our non-destructive options. And on page 185, they talk about this. The create individual files option, it's the most common, is what's going to happen is it's going to create a new file, it's going to process it, and then it's going to leave the original audio file, for example, this piano file, it's going to leave it unchanged, so it's non-destructive, obviously, it's not changing it. And then it's going to process any partial clips in the original selection are going to become new clips. So let me demonstrate this in a second. So if I were to have selected this, for example, do you see how my selection now encompasses not only part of one clip, but the beginning of another? If I choose create individual files, because I have two individual clips in my selection, when it processes, it's going to create individual files for this particular process. Whereas if I did a continuous file, it's going to do the same non-destructive process, except it's going to write it to one particular file. Let me demonstrate this very, very quickly. So create individual files. I'm just going to render this super quick. And if we look over here at our track playlist, we now see that I have the first part of my selection and the second part of my selection created as separate clips, individual files. I'm going to go back now, undo that, and now I'm going to choose create continuous file and choose render. And when it creates my new file, you'll see that it took my selection, and there was even a little gap in there, and you can see that little gap right here in my file. It's created a continuous file as opposed to creating individual files. So that's an important thing to remember. And then the last section here, this clip by clip, what we're looking at here is the processing, what's called the processing input mode. And this is really when you're dealing with plugin analysis that contains multiple clips. So just like I have right here. This basically says when I apply a process, is it going to analyze each individual selection on this clip separately, clip by clip, or if I have something selected that encompasses multiple clips, is it going to look at the waveform entirely on both clips, thinking that it's one continuous file or one continuous waveform or not? A better way to describe this would be on page 186 when they talk about the normalizing option. So let's say I have a selection over top of this entire 3-clip span here. And I'm going to go, instead of deverb, I'm going to go to the normalize plugin. This is what they're talking about on page 186. In case you don't know what normalizing is a dynamic process that basically takes a look at an audio file and it looks at the transients in that audio file. It finds the highest transient, the largest transient, and then it measures the distance of that waveform's peak to the distortion or the ultimate output where it would begin to distort. It then takes that ratio and it applies it to all of the other transients in the waveform, and it basically boosts the level by that same little ratio. So it takes the largest waveform, it looks at how high it is from the ultimate distortion ceiling, and then once it knows that number, it applies that boost. It applies a boost of that ratio level to all of the other transients in the file. Now, when we think of that process, if we're applying normalize to 3 individual clips, all of which have completely different transients in it, you can see this. This particular clip has a completely different set of transients than these. If I was to apply normalization and I was to go back to this clip by clip or entire selection option, if I were to go clip by clip, what's happening is it's going to normalize all 3 of these clips, but it's going to normalize each one of them individually. It's as opposed to if I were to have entire selection, it would take a look at all 3 clips, find the largest transient in all 3 of those clips, and then apply that ratio across all 3 clips. So it's a completely different process, clip by clip, or entire selection. This is a very dense and hard concept to really grasp, so you can either watch this lecture multiple times or also go through your book. Your book explains it in the same way on page 186, and it's very, very important to go over this clip by clip or entire selection. I'll demo this for you really quickly though, so if I zoom in a bit, and I'm going to make these particular clips, or tracks I should say, a little larger for us to look at, we will be able to explore how this affects the process. So when I take a look here, let's say I go to entire selection and I go to render. I'm going to create individual files. Going to render, using playlist so we can see it. Okay, so what it did was it looked at the entire selection, and if I go back in time, you can see that probably out of this entire selection, the highest transient is this one right here. Okay, so it's basically going to render based on the ratio that existed between that clip and the other clips. So it's then going to apply that normalization across the board all at once, and it does. Now if I undo this and go back to clip by clip, now it's going to look at each clip individually and proportionally normalize it based on the transients in that clip alone. Now when I go to render, I have a completely different outcome. They look completely different. This particular clip up top looks way hotter than it did before when I did the entire selection. So it's then taking this entire clip and normalizing it individually. So it's very important to keep this in mind when you're using those options. Moving along here on page 187 and 188, to finish this little section out, it then talks about configuring your plugin parameters. I'm going to go back to the delay or the reverb option. Okay, and I'm going to zoom back out, and I'm going to shift option medium, go back to normal size here. And I just want to go over what they talk about here is these different plugin parameters. The last part here would be you configuring your particular plugin. And I'll just show you if I were to audition this particular selection. Let's say I'm going to perform Audio Suite, and I go to the audition button. It allows me to audition and make changes here in real time. Okay, so I can utilize this to change settings, audition them, and once I'm then happy with them, step 5 is to actually process the audio. And you process the audio by clicking this render button. Now, there's a very important little text field here, this 2.0. What this is back in the beginning of the chapter, or the section, I talked about Audio Suite handles. This is that pre-separate amount that I was talking to you about. So when I have this 2.0, what this is talking about is seconds. How many seconds of pre-separate time do you want to allow? This is important when you're thinking about something like a reverb plugin or any time-based plugin, because what you're worried about here are reverb tails. If you want your reverb to actually tail off, you're going to want to have some type of pre-separate amount at the end so that there's not an abrupt cutoff of that reverb tail. So watch what happens if I were to completely disregard this and say 0 for the handle. I have my selection made. Instead of using playlist, I'm going to have it create a clip in the clips list. And in a second, I will process. And I'll go render. It renders the file, and it then creates for me a piano Pt4 clip, which is indicating that it was processed. Now, when I bring this into my session, this has the reverb selected on it. I'm going to solo it so that we can hear it. But did you hear how that reverb completely just cut off out of nowhere? It was very unnatural. The reverb wasn't, it didn't really sound very nice. It didn't give us that sense of space. So if I undo what I just did, and let's say now that I make that same selection that I did, and I'm going to now, instead of having 0 buffer time, I'm going to choose a 5-second pre-separate amount on the beginning and the end of that particular clip. Click render. Now into my clips list, I see that I now have my new clip there, piano Pt4. Bring it in here. Hello. Drop it in. Didn't create it for me. Why didn't it do that? Okay. Let's try again. Okay, here we go. This file, which is denoted, let's see if it did it for me this time. No, it didn't. Oh, it did. Okay, there we go at the very, very end. You can see I now have a pre-separate amount at the end, or a handle. And now when I play this file back, do you hear how there's now some space for a decay? So I now have the ability to trim this if I need to. I have some space where I can trim it if I want. Whereas before it was such an abrupt change, there was no audio. This is called an audio suite handle. There was no handle before. And the last thing to mention in this chapter is talking about how files are named. As you can see, whenever I created a new file using Audio Suite, and I'll go back here, you see that depending on if this is a playlist selection or a clip list selection, the files are named differently. So when I create, for example, a selection and I have playlist selected, when I click render, it names it piano Pt4, that's the plugin, it adds a hyphen, the plugin name, an underscore, and then a number indicating starting with 01. This is indicating that I actually had done this 2 times prior, so this is now the 3rd time that I've applied Pt4 to this particular clip. And contrast that, though, with if I had this by clip list and I selected the entire clip. I go to render. It now creates a new clip for me, same clip name, hyphen, the plugin name, another hyphen, not an underscore, but another hyphen, and then 2 numbers starting with 0, 0. That difference is highlighted on 188 and 189. I really suggest that you take a look at that and review that. Also, like I said a million times before here, please go through this section and study it. Very important stuff. And we're going to end here, and then we'll finish with working with the clip list.